Hi guys. Hello, I'm Suzanne Cox. I'm with Saltmarsh, Cleveland and Gund, and we're here today to bring together the knowledge and expertise of a few firms, Saltmarsh, Cleveland and Gund, along with our fellow BRP partner firms, AHT Insurance, BKS Partners, Burnham Benefits, and INS Group. In today's session, we'll be covering the rise of ransomware, the evolution, risks, and recovery. Don't forget, this webinar is being recorded. So later today, you will receive an email and it will have a link to the recording as well as the presentation materials that you can look through later in case you forget any of this information that you'll be receiving today. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them to the GoToWebinar chat panel and we will address questions at the end of the presentation. Not to worry though, if we don't get to your question, we will be following up with emails for any questions that are missed today. So let's go ahead and dive right in. We've got three great presenters here to share some information with you that we hope will be really helpful for your business. First, we've got Trevor Williams. He is a commercial risk advisor with Baldwin Kristen Sherman, and he is a registered professional liability underwriter. And I've been working all morning to say that really fast. It's a lot of words. He mainly consults with healthcare clients across the Southeast, and he analyzes their unique risk profile to make sure that their risk management and their insurance align with their corporate goals. Felicia Thorpe is a property and casualty risk consultant with AHT, and she focuses on insurance and strategic risk management for tech companies and government contractors. She has an extensive background in risk mitigation, and she loves to collaborate with her clients to find innovative ways to strengthen their business. Finally, we've got Jason. He's with Saltmarsh, has over 20 years of experience in the field, and currently serves as a senior technology risk consultant. He specializes in consulting with clients in industries such as financial institutions, healthcare, and government contractors. He does things like information security assessments and vulnerability testing. Internally, we call these boys the dumpster divers. So I will, with no further ado, I will pass it over to you.
Thanks, Suzanne. I appreciate the intro. I guess really today, what we would spend time talking about, we don't have time to get highly in-depth on ransomware, but we're going to spend a little bit of time helping you kind of understand the landscape, the changes that are going on in the space. If you've been paying attention to the news, you've been seeing an awful lot of things coming out lately. It just seems like it's kind of hitting the national psyche all of a sudden, and we're paying attention and we're seeing and we're understanding. And you'll see kind of as we go through the next few slides, there's been a long kind of evolutionary process here. Ransomware is growing and it's expanding and it's really kind of hitting us in our pocketbooks all of a sudden. So we'll talk about a little bit about understanding ransomware, what it is and how it's gotten to where it is today. We'll talk a little bit about how you kind of set up your risk framework and get an understanding of how to protect yourself and how to get the right insurance in place and how to respond. And then we'll kind of come through at the end and pick back up some questions as we have. And then as always, if you have questions after this later on that we just couldn't get into in depth, send us an email, shoot us some communication, and we'll try to work with you and get back with you and respond with you. So let's talk just a little bit at the very beginning here. This slide you see is just kind of what's going on today. Now, I know we've had the Colonial Pipeline attack, and we've had some things that have really hit a lot of news coverage. But just kind of looking back, 2020, everybody went home, and I guess we were all working from home, and all of a sudden these ransomware attacks, even though we've got maybe 5, 6, 7 years of just steady increases, that really kind of hit a new pace this year. Or this last year, it seems like. So if you look kind of the slides here, and man, these statistics are all over the map. If you Google and you look up how much these things have increased, you'll see as much as 700%. Since attacks have gone up almost as 700%. I tried to go with a little bit more conservative numbers. So in 2020, even though 2019 was a record year and a pace year, we've gone up yet another 150% in attacks. In 2020, the payments started to increase substantially as well. In 2021, so far is trending higher. As I mentioned, you've got the Colonial Pipeline attack, you've got JBS Meats, you've got a lot of different things that have hit. And one big one that we'll talk about just in a little bit too, the DC Metro Police, which was a new type of ransomware attack. So what we're going to do is we'll talk a little bit through kind of the beginning, the middle, and then kind of what's going on today and the way that ransomware has changed over time. So let's maybe talk just briefly. In the beginning, back in the 80s, this guy named Joseph Popp, he kind of got everything going. He got it started. And it's kind of an odd way to think about ransomware, but what he did is he took floppy disks. He sent out, I believe, 20,000 floppy disks to people at the World Health Organization conference, and he just wanted to see if they would download this and encrypt it and install it, and some people did. And there was a PO box. The FBI eventually ran it down, but really ransomware didn't go anywhere. In 1989, if you had to send a floppy disk to do it, and you had to collect by somebody mailing you a check, wasn't a lot that's gonna happen there. But over time, kind of getting going in the middle 2000s, really what happened was, the internet got better, we got better ways of delivering these things, and all of a sudden ransomware really started to pop back up, and we had some encryption pieces there. And so really what happens in a ransomware attack is somehow something gets into your system. Maybe you click on an email, maybe you download something you shouldn't, and it starts to encrypt files and lock files up. And so the MO in the beginning was it locks it up. It stays right there. The information lives there on your device. It's just you can't access it anymore. The first demands, they were pretty low. I mean, as much as you'd see demands for a couple $100, a few $100, maybe 1,000, maybe 1,500 for a company, nothing significant. And a lot of times it was just easier to pay, restore, and move on. One thing that really kind of helped to move that payment process along was that, we mentioned earlier, somebody had to mail a check. Now that Bitcoin gets developed, and getting into what 2008, I believe, is when Bitcoin kind of finally made a pop and came out. Once that got developed and there's a way to anonymously pay, that really opened up the ability to make these attacks and actually get money and bring that money back to wherever in the world you happen to be, and do it without worry of repercussions of somebody tracking you down. So that really kind of was the beginning stages of what really made this take off. And what's interesting is, if you've ever dealt with it, the customer service end of the ransomware attacks are very good. They'll help you buy Bitcoin in the beginning as people were trying to understand, well, let me help you buy Bitcoin, let me help you with this, let me help you recover. There was a very intentional attempt on the part of ransomware companies or ransomware entities to help you through the process. They'd even promised to leave you alone afterwards. And then that kind of is where we stayed at for a while. But then as evolution goes along, people have great ideas. There was a model developed called ransomware as a service, which really, if you're familiar with software as a service, like when you contract with Microsoft or somebody to use their products, ransomware as a service is what really kind of helped create these mass attacks that we're seeing now. Because what it took was, you didn't have to know anymore. You just had to be somebody that was willing to act and do something wrong. You didn't have to actually know how to code this stuff. You didn't actually have to know how to deploy it. You worked with one of these ransomware companies, ransomware as a service companies, and you actually said, I will try to infiltrate and find the right vector. You provide me with all the services of how the software works and how to collect the money over time, and I'll just be your boots on the ground. And so that helped, all of a sudden you had an army of criminals that are willing to do this to try to find money, and they would subcontract basically with these ransomware companies. And then, we all finally said, hey, let's really focus on our backups. One of the big piece was, if we had a good, strong backup, then we could say, all right, you've encrypted my data, but I had a good backup that was protected from ransomware because I had the right set up correctly somewhere else. So I'll just have to wipe everything, start over again. So then that kind of pushed the evolution and the need to be able to create ransomware that could kind of come in and sit on your system for a little while and take some time before it started to encrypt things, find the backups, encrypt the backups as well, and then time release deployment, so it would automatically just encrypt everything at one given time in the future. So that was kind of where we stood up until recently. So what's going on today, which represents some very new changes and things that are important to kind of pay attention to. In the last little bit, we've started to see data exfiltration. So for a long time, because we didn't have great internet connections, we had to have, it was easier to deploy it, it was easy to encrypt it, but it was hard to pull it back and actually hold on to it. So, for the longest time, that wasn't feasible. But now that everybody has such good internet connections, such strong bandwidth, what's happening is when you deploy this, when you actually click on something you shouldn't, it's getting onto your machines, it's getting onto your system, but they're taking time. They're trying to understand how they get more data from you. They find things that they think are important for your company, for you, and they pull it back slowly over to their side, so that when they do finally deploy this encryption, they not only have your stuff locked down and you have to worry about that, but even if you have a great backup, all of a sudden now you have this new risk that they have your data. They have the things that are significant to you. I mentioned kind of at the top of this, there was the DC ransomware attack. There were some pretty big headlines recently where a criminal group had gotten into the DC Metro Police Department through a ransomware attack. And one thing that they said they would do is if they weren't paid, they would release the name of the gang informants that the police department had, which in theory could put some people's lives in danger. So they said, we found a file, we found what's important, we found something that people will pay up for, and they'd already pulled it over to their network. So they had it. Even if DC police said, we won't pay you, we'll just restore and go on, they had this significant information. So that's really kind of a new change that's going on. Now that's a scary one, and there's a fair amount of that going on. Racetrack's another one. Another change that's happened very recently was not only are they pulling your data over, but they're starting to communicate with your clients, your customers, your partners. And one recent example was Racetrack had a ransomware attack as well. It's public, it's kind of something that people have followed, but they even emailed all of those rewards customers. So people that had a Racetrack rewards card, they actually emailed all of those folks and said, hey, your company you're working with here has been compromised. You might want to contact them and tell them that they should pay the ransom. Now, if you're a rewards customer, you've lost a few bits of information, but you can kind of understand how powerful that process would be. Because one thing that we have been able to do through this as a company is control the narrative. But all of a sudden, we can't even control the narrative. Now, all of a sudden, someone can release our information. And not only can they release our information on a shame wall, where they put it out there to say they didn't pay, here's the stuff that they did, they also are going to go ahead and contact folks and say, I'm releasing information on this company. They've been attacked, and then that adds an extra layer of push, from the outside world. So, and then the final thing that happened in October 2020 that I guess we should all be aware of is in many cases, a lot of companies are paying and need to pay. Sometimes it makes the right sense to pay this demand that's out there. But in 2020, the Treasury Department came out and said, we have certain individuals, certain entities that we have sanctions against. We put them on a list. It's called the OFAC list. And what we want you to do is know that if you're paying some of these entities, you may be committing a crime yourself. So they've kind of added a little bit of extra layer of complexity there that says not only is there a risk in paying, but there's a risk now if you pay that we may come after you. So, there's a lot going on in this space, but the key thing to remember here, I think, for you to watch is data exfiltration now. You can't just have a great backup. You have to worry about that they got your data first. Sometimes folks are spending a lot of time on a network, and it's translating into an additional risk that we didn't have in the past. And with that, Felicia, I think I'll pass it over to you if that's okay.
Thanks so much, Jason. So to Jason's point, I'd like to back up a little bit here and talk about what is ransomware for those people who may have had some questions about the items that he's going over. So by definition, it's essentially just a malware. And once it accesses the system, it locks down the information. And in order to get it back, you have to pay money. So the initial access can happen in a lot of different ways. One of the most common ways is through your employees, well-meaning people clicking on links or downloading an application or possibly just getting into a document. Once they're in there, the information can then get into the network. So now they're just sitting back there and they're waiting. They want to see what's at stake. So once they've infiltrated the system, the network reconnaissance, they're going to see, is anything worth of value? What can we get from this? And at this point, there really isn't a lot that I could say is not of value. I mean, back, Jason, you mentioned back in the day when they first started, it might be a couple $100s. Right now, the way that we do business, almost everybody has some collectible personal protected information that could be worth money. So once they've done that, that's the data exfiltration. They're basically looking at, do we deploy? Do we evaluate this information and make a demand? Once they've determined that that is worth value, they are going to actually utilize the malware to lock your system down. And I think what most people have in their mind is that if they have backups, they're safe. But again, to Jason's point, there's so much access out there that now they can not only get a hold of your system, but they can also access your backup. So now you're left in a place where they can demand pretty much anything of you in order to resume work. All right. So I just really wanted to kind of go over, I think that there's a misunderstanding amongst a lot of organizations I talk to that believe that ransomware is something that happens to large organizations or people who have, the big pockets. And realistically, if you were a hacker, you can see that a middle market to small organization likely doesn't have the same capabilities as a large organization. So they're actually going to be looking for the easy target, the low-hanging fruit. And in 2020, this is just sort of a overview of the different industries that have been affected. Consumer discretionary, that just means that they were not willing to say what industry they were from. But you can see that it varies. There isn't one in particular industry that's being hit more than others. I think that you'll see that you really could be at risk regardless of your industry and regardless of your size. We were showing, we kind of were going through this, and Jason had a stat there that said, 170% is what the ransom had gone up in 2020. But I really wanted to show in 1 quarter's worth of time, the increase of the demand went up by nearly 50%. And that shows us that these cyber events are happening at a greater rate because they can see that there's an increase in profitability. Now, this is the Kroll April 2021 Spotlight. Kroll is an organization that essentially provides intel over to individuals about the governance and risk trends in cyber. I thought this one was particularly interesting because I think a lot of people are familiar with some of the things that happened in April. The first thing I want to point out is impacted sectors. I can tell you, I deal a lot in technology firms, and they understandably recognize that cyber is something they need to pay attention to. That is the business that they're in. But there are a lot of different industries that really didn't see this as pertaining to them. As you can see here, manufacturing accounted for 16%. And 2 to 3 years ago, it was really a struggle to get manufacturers to see that this was going to affect their business. Cyber was not something they were concerned about. They put a lot of time and effort into safety, bodily injury, property damage. Those things made sense to them. There wasn't a way for them to make a connection because there weren't a lot of cases where they could see how somebody going into their system and even a small breach could really affect their capability to do business. Healthcare, professional services, I think those things probably make more sense. We're all, well aware that HIPAA would be some valuable information. Trevor will talk to you a little bit about that. But what I found most interesting about this specific spotlight was that in April, there was a very, the phishing attacks seemed to be mirroring what had happened in the past. The difference is, if you take a look, if you guys remember Hafnium, the Hafnium hack that happened in February, that was a big Microsoft Exchange issue. And the big deal there was that it was for those people who had on-premises servers networks. You can see how quickly this evolves because by April, it was also an email compromise, but now they had moved to the cloud. So it is really imperative that you are staying on top of not only the trends, but just a general sense of protecting your servers, your networks, your employees, and making sure the education's out there because they will just go from one gamut to the next, making sure that if people are going to now be really protecting the on-premises, well, then who are we going to attack next? It's going to be people who are using the cloud. The top ransomware variant was DarkSide. And for those of you who don't know what DarkSide was, you probably are very much familiar with the Colonial Pipeline hack. I actually was just reading up on this and I found it very interesting because while they did get the ransom, the hackers became a little bit lazy, and it was just sort of announced this week that the FBI was able to recover $2.3 million in Bitcoin because they did all of that work to get in there and hack the system, but not a lot of work to protect themselves. And so the FBI was able to track it down and recover quite a bit of that ransomware payout. So at this point, I think there has been a big impact on organizations from an underwriting standpoint and from people who are looking to secure cyber insurance because email is how we do business. And Microsoft Exchange has been a big target for some of these hackers. And I would venture to guess that a large majority of us are utilizing Microsoft Exchange as our email on a day-to-day basis. So these are the types of things that you need to be aware of and need to be preparing for. So how does this change your renewal? How does this prepare you as you're getting ready to protect yourself against possible, cyber events? The market is already hardening. So a hardened market is essentially when the carriers as a whole have to increase premiums to adjust for losses that have been paid out. So I would tell you, we were looking at a hardening market in a lot of different policies, late 2019, early 2020, and 2020, and the rise of claims because of COVID really started to ramp that up. And I have really, just in a personal note, seen some significant increases that have happened just in this last quarter. And a lot of that is just because the carriers are paying out for every single time you see in the news that there is a breach or a big cyber event. Those people are protected. They are claiming that to their carriers. The carriers are submitting losses and having to pay out. Previous to probably the last 2 or 3 years, there hasn't been a lot of claims experience. So the pricing of cyber insurance or professional tech E&O was sort of done at the whim of the underwriter. They didn't have a lot of hard data to support it. So now that they're actually having to pay out, we're seeing a reduction in coverage. So now that we go into these renewals, it could be that you had a $5 million limit and the carrier's only willing to offer $3 million. We certainly are seeing reductions in the excess limits. So if you have requirements through any contracts to have $10 million worth of coverage, we may have to go to excess carriers and layer excess over excess because each carrier is very conservative on what they want to offer. We've gotten non-renewals. A lot of that has to do with the information that they're requesting from our clients. It used to be maybe 3 or 4 questions. Do you have a firewall? Do you have an IT director? Now we're getting supplemental applications in order to provide ransomware that could be anywhere from 2 to 4 pages. And it's really important that not only from the standpoint of just securing insurance, but a lot of what they're asking could be how you protect your organization from an event. The other piece of that is increased retention. So it's like a deductible you pay with your healthcare. You pay that first and then the insurance will step in. We are seeing they want you to have more skin in the game. They don't want you to rely on insurance in order to protect. They want you to know that if you are not doing the things that you needed to do in order to protect against that event, you're going to be coming out of pocket as well. So the increased scrutiny from the underwriters, that's really just a matter of them realizing that they have to know what's happening. They need to get underneath the hood. And we've seen ransomware, which used to be part of your first party coverages, pretty regularly become something that could be taken off of a contract, or they could be asking for supplemental apps. So it almost is like a standalone coverage there in order to obtain it. They also want to see multi-factor authentication. That's, we've been doing that for years, but just to let you know, that's a type of thing when you're trying to get into your email, you need to sign in on your phone, they send you a code, then you go back and you log in. If you bank anywhere, even I think most social media platforms are doing a similar thing. It is annoying. Lots of employees have complained about it. I promise you, this is the type of thing that everybody will be doing and will be required to do going forward. There's also the increase in premiums. I have seen a significant jump. The hard market has been driven by several things: COVID-19, market conditions of previous payouts, and then these huge ransom attacks that have happened even just in 2021. We saw an increase of 18% in Q1. So when you start to annualize that, you can see year over year, I've already been delivering anywhere from 50 to 65% on average from last year at this time. And I think that that goes to really this last point here. If you're having 404% jump in 2018 to 2019, you can only imagine the number of claims that went out and these underwriters realizing we didn't know what we were doing. And now we're having to pay out this money. So we need to start increasing premiums. And it's 2018 and 2019 that started the hardening market. Now that we've seen the evolution and the increase from 2020 and 2021, I can only anticipate that this is going to get worse. So really what we want to focus on is, what do you do? And some of this may seem very basic. It may seem like, obviously we're doing these things, but there aren't, all industries were not created the same. Not everybody was focused on technology, But now that everybody really could at some point consider themselves a technology company, they need to all be on the same page. So just having strong overall security procedures, that's a very basic idea, but it's a matter of having a team that is going to continuously look for what are the best practices and following that. Deployment of patches, this is one of those things where this is how they get in. It is important and it is often overlooked. Multi-factor authentication, remote desktop protocols, those are the types of things that are just going to really make sure that the right people are connected to the right level of information. I do think that security efforts, open ports, these are all the technical things that your IT team should be really honing into. But I think one of the really important pieces of this is that you incorporate conversations about risk and exposure. You need to make sure that your IT team is involved, because there are so many times when you finally get everybody all in the same room, you start to realize that maybe the money they're asking for in order to protect the organization that seems sort of out of whack with the budget is going to protect you on the backside. Maybe it allows for you to have higher limits, maybe it reduces your premium, but you're only going to know that if you're having that conversation. Disaster recovery and continuity plans. Now, this is the one piece that I think a lot of people are lacking in. Do you have an incident response plan? Do you have something written in the instance that you find out today that you've had a breach? And beyond that, have you practiced it? Have you sat down and done a tabletop exercise? Are you doing pen testing? And do your employees know what to do if they've identified that something has happened? We could probably talk about this one point for 10, 15 minutes, but I can tell you that there are a lot of times when the employee has either figured out there's a breach or has been approached by somebody outside of the organization and been asked about the breach. Your employees need to know that they need to refer back to a specific person in the instance they find it or in the instance they've been asked about it. And to piggyback off of the employee piece, we know that that's probably your most vulnerable area. Your employees want to do what's best by you, but they need to know what to do. So that means ongoing and continuous training on phishing, security, and then making sure that it's done on a regular basis.
Hey, Felicia, I want to pop in real quick here on your number 5. I just wanted to point out, as an auditor, part of our process is to ask if you have a disaster and recovery plan, and we get a copy of it and make sure that you have it. But one thing that we always ask is, have you done it? Have you walked through it? Have you practiced it? When's the last time you actually restored a backup? When's the last time that you walked through the plan? When you go to hotels, there's this fire exit plan, right? And sometimes they do drills. You need to do those kind of drills internally. So I just wanted to add that point here, is that to number 5, it's great if you have a plan, but you need to actually walk through it and make sure that it works and that your backups actually restore when you go to restore them.
Yeah, I can assure you the last thing you want to do when you're in the face of a cyber event is to be reading through your disaster plan for the first time.
What are we doing?
Yeah, I mean, I can't tell you how many people who realize that if their system's down, they don't have their IT director's phone number. Like, how do we even contact people if the email and the network's down? So if any of these things happen, of course, that is what insurance is for. And I want to introduce Trevor Williams, who's going to discuss and talk to us about how that responds if the breach does happen. Trevor?
Thanks, Felicia, for that really insightful analysis of the risk mitigation and management measures we should be implementing on the front end, and an overview of the market. It really segues into the insurance coverage piece. So I'm going to start with a quick overview of cyber insurance policies, just to set the stage on where ransomware falls and fits in. Cyber policies are generally divided into 2 categories: first-party coverages and third-party coverages. First-party coverages, some examples are, if you have a cyber attack or ransomware attack, you're going to immediately have to engage forensics firms, people to try to restore your data, find out what happened and to the extent of the damage. You may even have some business interruption, that your business is down because of the cyber event for a period of time, could be days, could be weeks. And, similar to a property insurance policy, that business interruption will pay out up to the limit, but pay out your net income that you've lost. And, these first party risks are expenses that you pay out on behalf of yourself in a cyber event. And, one last example that kind of touches on what Felicia was talking about employee training is social engineering. Another word for that is phishing or spear phishing, where a hacker tricks one of your employees in accounting maybe to, hey, this is the CEO, please wire $100,000 to, our attorney vendor over here. And, the email looks and feels just like it's from someone in your organization or someone you trust. And, an employee at 5 o'clock in the afternoon on a Friday it just wires the money and boom, it's gone. So, those are a couple examples of first party risks. And third party risks and coverages have to do with money you pay out on behalf of others. So, these are legal damages and defense costs and regulatory fines, where if you lose your customers' information or your employees' protected health information, PHI, or if you're a financial institution and you lose your customers' financial data, and someone else has a hold of it, well, they're probably going to come after you for legal damages and even mount a class action lawsuit where, you're paying those damages on behalf of, other people's loss and because you were responsible for their data and were negligent. So the big question is, where does ransomware fit in to a cyber policy and to these coverages? And the answer is a mix of both. Mostly it falls into first party because you're going to pay, a lot of those expenses on behalf of yourself to, like I said before, find out what happened, determine the extent of the ransomware damage, and even paying the ransom if that's appropriate. But obviously it can overlap into third party coverages because if it's a big enough ransom, and enough third party information has been compromised, then you could end up going to court for it. So I will note that on the first party risks, these are typically the most common payouts for cyber claims and ransomware too. And these specialist firms that you have to engage, for forensics and data restoration and, negotiating with the hackers, they typically run about $500 an hour. So if you're working, with multiple firms over the course of days and weeks, you can imagine how quickly the costs run up and eat into your cyber limits. Okay, so like any insurance, cyber policies are complex legal contracts, and contrasted with something like a property insurance policy, every cyber policy is different. There is no boilerplate language. Every single one is different. So they contain a long list of exclusions and conditions in the policy contract. I typically use the example when I'm talking to clients and prospective clients that, the coverage might look clear on the face page or the declarations page, but, on page 252 in subparagraph B, subsection C, this coverage is actually limited or excluded because of XYZ reason. So really, really important and crucial to, before you're procuring coverage and setting it into place, to work with your broker and make sure you have a thorough understanding of the coverages, what is excluded, what's limited, etc. And I will say that some exclusions can be removed. Some can't, but some can with additional premium if it's worth it to you, or further underwriting, further questions. So for the purposes of this webinar, I'm including the exclusions and conditions that are most applicable to ransomware. There's obviously others than these, but these are most applicable. So one thing to watch out for is a authentication exclusion or condition. And that really says that if your employee who clicked on a link and the ransomware ended up getting into your system, or clicked on a link from a hacker or bad actor, if they didn't try to authenticate that person's identity as a trusted employee or third party vendor, if they didn't try to email them back or give them a call and say, hey, are you really who you say you are, then coverage could be excluded if the employee doesn't do that. So that is a huge one to look out for, not only as it pertains to ransomware, but social engineering and phishing as well. Prior knowledge, this is kind of a given, but if you know about a ransomware event before the policy begins and you didn't disclose it to the insurance company, and they find out and it comes to light, coverage could be voided and rescinded back to policy inception, and you're left with nothing. When you sign a cyber insurance application, there's a warranty that says, I'm not aware of any other incidents that I haven't disclosed. So if you violate that, sorry. And then there's the consent provision and there's a few different components to this. In a cyber insurance policy, it'll state when you need the insurer's written consent to incur costs. And so, typically it might say something like, you can incur costs without their written consent for the first 72 hours or 48 hours or whatever it is, because you really have to deal with the circumstances at hand, and then anytime after that period of time, you have to have their written consent to incur costs. Also include language about approved panel providers. So make sure you know who to contact and who's already approved on the insurance company's panel before a claim happens. Another component to it is consent to settle. Really important to make sure that you as the insured or policyholder or client have the consent to settle. Okay. It's an event that's affecting your business, and even though the insurance company may be paying out on your behalf, the claim goes on your record. So, make sure you have that consent to settle, and your attorney can work with you on that. And then, as I mentioned, alluded to, if you do have a preferred attorney or other, cyber incident related provider, make sure you ask the carrier on the front end if they will add that firm to the approved panel. Because if you don't, and you're like, well, I have this attorney that I want to work with, but they're not on the insurance company's panel of providers, you might be stuck between a rock and a hard place. And insurance company will make that decision based on the firm's experience and area of expertise. And then, the paying the ransom, as Jason mentioned before, it's important to know that the policy may contain a provision about terrorist organizations or countries or other organizations that are blacklisted by the U.S. government. And if you pay those organizations, right away, it may not be covered in your cyber policy. All right, so if you do have an attack, what should you do? It is crucially important. Report it as soon as possible. Like, I don't care if you discover the incident at 2 a.m., call the 24/7 hotline that should be in your policy, and explain what happened. I mean, everyone thinks that, I'll report the claim to my broker and let them handle it. Well, you should keep your broker in the loop, but for sure, but they might be out of the office, or it might be after hours or not working. So time is of the essence when you do have a claim, because the quicker that you can engage the carrier's, team of experts to negotiate with that bad actor demanding the ransom, the quicker it's going to be resolved. And it's even possible that the incident response team might, dig into your systems and find out that the hacker's actually bluffing. They're saying they have control and demanding a ransom, but they really don't have sufficient control, and you might be able to take it back and not have to pay the ransom. So really important to get that process started ASAP. And if you wait long enough, you could be penalized in terms of limited coverage, and the carrier not paying out as much if you wait a long time to report it, because it could have been prevented, like I said earlier. I kind of touched on this, don't pay the ransom unless the response team authorizes payment. They are trained specialists in responding to hackers, and we are not necessarily trained specialists, clients and prospects running a business. And then make sure you keep track of all pertinent information, especially as it relates to business interruption. From the minute that you discover an attack, keep track of any income or customers or revenue that you've lost because your systems have been down. And that'll really expedite the process on the back end of getting, getting a reimbursement paid to you of that time you were down. And then just any other technical details that you've discovered, just keep track of everything. And this may go without saying, but work collaboratively with the breach response teams provided by the insurance company and the legal teams, whether it's the insurance companies or your own. There's typically a condition in the policy or a clause that says, you should be working collaboratively and not creating any kind of harmful relationship that might negatively affect the value of the claim. So just be collaborative and helpful. So that is the conclusion of the content of the webinar. But we do want to move on to some real life stories that each of us have seen in our line of work. So I think first I will pass it over to Jason.
Thanks, Trevor. I think before we go into some of these stories, it's probably important to say that simply because someone's experienced a ransomware attack does not mean they did anything wrong. I mean, there are major government organizations, there are very well run entities. Everyone is susceptible to an attack. And, there's a process where you prepare and you try to avoid one. There's a process where you plan for one if you have one, and there's a process of recovery. And just because we mentioned some sort of group here, that doesn't mean that they were sloppy. That doesn't mean they did something wrong. It means that they happened to get hit by it. And you can easily look at history recently and go, wow, I'm sure that was a well-run organization. There's healthcare organizations, there's banks, and we hear about very few of these. Really, most of these are still kind of a private conversation. Payments happen, things occur, and it's kept kind of out of the spotlight. But what we can say is, and what we kind of wanted to do is note that this just isn't big organizations out there that make press. This is the local small entities that we deal with every day, which probably most of you are. Most of you fall in that medium-sized business or small business where you don't have 30,000 employees and huge resources, and you're not going to get a $40 million demand, but you still are going to have all of the same heartache and frustration going through the process. So really just want to talk about a couple that I've dealt with recently here, and maybe sort of once we're through that, hey, we've got it. And in case here, there's two that got it, and I'm just going to talk briefly through the response process. One is construction, about 100 employees. One is manufacturing, about 150 employees. The construction entity just really hadn't worked through the backup process the way they should. They had an on-site backup. it got easily encrypted as part of the ransomware when it rolled through, when it finally deployed. So they ended up losing several weeks of work. They didn't have cybersecurity insurance. They lost several weeks of work. It took them a lot of money to kind of work through the process, and they had to restore from a very old backup. So they were in the end lost several months worth of data, several months of things that they, how many of us can afford to lose that kind of information, come back and still stay in business? Some of us can, some of us can't. Another entity got it, the manufacturing entity, they had one, they got infected. They had a very strong, robust backup process that also included a very disconnected kind of cloud backup with the ability to restore, to recover some of those operations. And what actually happened is they ended up shutting down the primary system so that it could be, you've got all these experts and all these folks that need to come in and figure out, where did it come from and how do I stop it from replicating and what do I need to do to bring my main system back online. In the interim, they were able to determine that this kind of disconnected, disjointed backup system in the cloud was clean and would not replicate, and they were able to restore very much within hours. And to the outside user, no one noticed a difference. Even most of the employees didn't notice a difference because it kind of happened late in the evening, and by the next day they were up running. Things were slow, but there are some ways to build your systems redundantly such that even when you get one, that doesn't mean that everything's done. And by being able to shut down that primary system, they're able to stop it from replicating and doing more damage. So, kind of two different things there. With the next slide here, though, I want to kind of just talk through just some really brief things. I know we're repeating stuff over and over again, but they are kind of important items. One thing that I see when I deal with folks is, in my thoughts, and I think Felicia, you mentioned a lot of this, and then Trevor, you mentioned several of these things too, is one of the most important things you can do is assume that, yes, I could get it. No matter what I do, I could get it. So let me plan for that. And we talked about, you need some sort of incident response process and plan. You need to have something in place that says, here's what I would do if it happened. Because as you walk through it, as you plan for it, that helps you to know. You don't lose valuable hours deciding, who do I contact? Who are my key partners? Who are people that need to be in the know? What is the process to respond to it immediately to make it be less damaging? You have all that written down, and if you test it and you walk through it, I think Felicia mentioned, doing an actual walkthrough process. If you do that, you're ready. It doesn't make it easy. It just makes it a little more manageable when it occurs. So really stop and take some time thinking about, there's some great organizations out there that have some free incident response plans that you can kind of walk through and will help you get started. There's lots of folks that can help you kind of build that out as you go, but it's something to really think through. What would we do? How would we respond? Don't wait till it happens to work through that process. The second piece is, and I think it's, there's been a hardening, I feel like, from my side, which I'm not an insurance person, but deal a lot with entities that are negotiating that process and kind of have had it for years, and now it's getting a little bit tougher. There's been a hardening that cyber insurance market. I think we're starting to determine as insurance companies perhaps what the claims really should be and what kind of loss rates there are, and so that's kind of changing the way that you go through this process. But having it in place early gives you two things. It gives you some comfort. I would think that, if the worst happens, I've got this here to help me through the process. And the other piece is, it gives you a partner. There are a lot of things that these insurance companies provide as part of that. You go through an underwriting process, and that's tough, and you have exclusions, and we mentioned some of that stuff, but there are some other things that they do provide that help you. You've got somebody to contact, you've got somebody that has expertise and resources and knows the process to flow and does deal with these on a regular basis, and that's helpful. And the other thing is, a lot of times we find that the people that we deal with, the other organizations we deal with, are risky. So you need to start thinking about, how do I make sure that those vendors I deal with are good and that they have strong security processes? You need to think some way of kind of underwriting and managing those folks as well, that you're not doing business with someone that's sloppy, that opens up your system to some sort of attack as well. And then, the other part of it, I'm going to say, call prepare here, but it's been mentioned a couple of times, but I think it's really important, is to say, let's assume that everything is shut down in our network. How do I communicate with people? Do I already have a prepared plan, a list of numbers, emails, some sort of secure communication channel, something that I can set up where I can at least communicate with all the important stakeholders? How do I get a hold of my CEO? How do I get a hold of my CIO? How do I get a hold of the folks that are on the executive team? How do we get together and talk about this when we can't use our email, and we can't use our network, and we can't use our corporate systems? That's something to think through that a lot of us kind of stop and forget about, but it's important. You know, those early moments of just being able to communicate and figure out what to do are going to be really helpful through the process. And a backup. Not only do you want as many backups, I don't know how many backups are enough, but let's have as many backups as we possibly can, as long as we're doing them in a secure kind of encrypted manner, because at least that's your data that you can recover. You may have a compromise, you may have things lost, you may have a response process there, but at least you could, if you had to, if you just couldn't come to an agreement, you've got your information to get back going, get back online. And test that. Don't just assume that it's working. Sometimes we set things up and it works, but then we make some change in our network and our system, and we didn't realize that certain things aren't being backed up anymore. So spend time at least annually kind of going back through and saying, I've got all these backups, are they working? Let me test and see, are they still working? Let me make sure that everything is going where it's supposed to and being there, so that if I do have to recover, I'm not surprised that there are things I can't get. And then one of the most important things that has been mentioned, but usually those that let in the ransomware are going to be us humans. It's going to be us clicking on something. You know, if we're running a good patching process, it's probably not that. It's probably going to be us going to a website and clicking on something we shouldn't, even though it seemed harmless to us, or going into an email and saying, this looks good, let me click on it. And so spending time training employees and training everybody that has some sort of access to your network is going to be well worth your time, probably required by a lot of the companies as you're binding cyber insurance these days, but also just well worth your time and proven to be pretty valuable. And then just from a protection standpoint, you could spend 6 months talking about all the things you can do, but one thing's been mentioned a couple of times and I would like to echo is multi-factor. It depends on who you listen to, who you read, but it might be something like 70 up to 99% of a lot of just the everyday average things that get tossed at you. Multi-factor deflects a lot of that. It's not a heavily expensive thing to add. Multi-factor, just for you, if you haven't followed, you know, it's something you know, something you are, something you have. So, you know, something you know is your user ID and your password, and those a lot of times get lost. You know, something you are could be something like your an eye scan or a fingerprint or something like that. Something you have may just be a device that you have. There are ways to deploy it, so you can put a certificate on a specific machine. That's something you have, you carry around with you, or a certificate on your phone. You may not always have to get a text message. I know Felicia kind of mentioned that it is annoying a lot of times when you log into Facebook or somewhere like that and it wants to send you that message. You got to type it in and go through that process. But there are lots of ways to go about multi-factor, and any way you do it, even though some are better than others, it's much better than leaving it open. And usually these days, most things have the capability to add it on for not a lot of additional fee. And I could tell you, I know of one pretty large institution recently that got denied for cyber insurance because they didn't have multi-factor built into their internal network, not the external, not just the stuff on the outside, but the internal network. It's becoming a must if you want the insurance, and you've got to assume if the insurance wants it, it's probably valuable. And it is, and that's why you can't do anything anymore online without getting a challenge question and having to type a code in, because it does knock down a lot of stuff. It's not perfect, there are ways around it, but it's better than not having. And then, you know, there's a lot of systems that are working more and more and more on helping you build rule sets and plans on the behaviors of others. You know, so if Jason almost never logs in at 2 a.m., shouldn't it set off an alarm if I try to log in at 2 a.m.? Or if Jason never changes more than 10 files a day and I change 50,000 all of a sudden, shouldn't I set off an alarm? There's a lot of that kind of monitoring stuff that is, you can, as the systems are wanting to learn the users and help you kind of refine to the things that are important for you that might indicate something's going on within your network. Because catching it early is always better than catching it late. And then just, you know, just a plain old basic cybersecurity hygiene kind of thing that's been out there for a long time, but make sure that those with access have the access they need and not just all access. You'd be surprised, regardless of the size of the institution, how often you're dealing with someone and you discover that they just applied an administrative right across the board to everybody. And a lot of times that's how these breaches kind of do lateral movement and pick up more and more things. It's based on the rights of who they got in with in the first place. So just a couple of quick things. Like I said, you could spend 6 months talking about things to do, but I think if you just spend time now planning for that it could happen and preparing for that, then you'll be in a lot better shape as we go down the road. Felicia, I think you've got a story you'll pass along too.
So I just wanted to share a story because I think that a lot of times people think it won't happen to me. So on this next slide here, there we go. We have a long-term manufacturing client, and I promise you I'm not picking on manufacturers, but it was just a situation where we had talked ad nauseum probably a little bit about how cyber was infiltrating all industries and why it was important for them to start really evaluating the need for cyber insurance. And our contact at this organization just really felt confident in the IT capability. And with a lot of companies where IT is not their focus, they had purchased and worked with a group who from the outside would come in. They did have some internal IT, but then they also brought on a third party who would do the majority of the oversight and did a lot in terms of their firewalls. And they had put some infrastructure and money in place in years prior. So they really couldn't see how this was going to help them because it was not going to happen to them. So famous last words, as you can imagine, what happened earlier this year was they were hit with a ransom attack. They are a manufacturing organization and they were shut down for 2 weeks. So there were some things that came from this that I don't think that they were really anticipating. So as much as we had talked about the first party capabilities of an insurance program, and Trevor talked about a lot of this, is the owner of the organization came back and said, well, in 2020, like all you could hear about with insurance was business income. Well, we've purchased, business income. At this point, we've lost 2 weeks of revenue and we've had to pay our employees. Can't we trigger that? And what is important to note is that if you have business income built into your GL or your package insurance policies, that is going to exclude anything related to data of cyber. This is really something that needs to be covered underneath your cyber policy as it's related to information. So not only were they not aptly covered from an insurance standpoint, just for the purpose of being able to do all the things, data restoration, whether or not there would be business income associated, being able to have money set aside for ransom, they recognized that they still had to operate a business. What also hit them that they weren't really prepared for was that their reputation was now harmed, because for a 2-week period of time, their existing clients and potential clients were hearing that they were not available for work or to be able to have access to their information. And that's another piece of the first party that we should sort of talk about, which is, what do you do in a situation where your reputation is harmed? If you don't have the right people in place to come back to you and say, listen, this is how we're going to talk about this event. It is not a matter of if, it is a matter of when for most organizations. And so knowing how you're going to respond, what messaging are you going to put out there to make sure that that doesn't further impact what revenue is going to come into you after you've had a cyber event. So no surprise to anybody, they did come back after this was all done and say, you know what, I think that it would really make sense for us to engage and have this conversation about adding cyber to our insurance program. They never disclosed to us what was paid out for this ransom. So long-term client, really great relationship, but they did purchase a $5 million cyber limit after the event. And so we did walk through all of the different avenues. We talked to them about what was included. We added some additional premium to expand some of the areas. And I think this was just a hard lesson learned by an organization who really, truly felt that they had what was needed to protect themselves. And Trevor, I think you had an example as well that you're going to share with us about healthcare.
Of course, yes. We'll move on from manufacturing. So this is a specialty physician group with 35 doctors in Florida. So sizable group, private practice. They have about 300 employees. So this is really the type and size of organization that we've been discussing that has a target on their back and they may not know it. In terms of that mid-size, at-risk industry. And they got hit with a ransomware incident. It's someone that we work with, and they did all the right things. We prepared them in advance for it. They had cyber insurance. They, engaged the appropriate specialist firms that, on the cyber insurers panel right away. Those firms started negotiating with the hacker and, did all the forensics and everything like that. And they ended up having to pay the ransom, which was about $500,000 all in Bitcoin. And they, at the end of the day, $500,000 ransom plus $500,000 of other mitigation, first party costs that they paid out, total claim was worth $1 million, which is crazy how fast it can add up. Luckily, an organization of this size should probably be carrying more than $1 million in cyber limit, and they had $3 million. Worked with them on a really consultative process to make sure they were, selected the right limit. So it paid out. Their balance sheet was totally protected, and they did everything right. But just a reminder of how quickly these claims can get up into the millions. So, and that those expenses erode the limit for the rest of the year. So, they had $3 million minus $1 million. They had $2 million for the rest of the year. Luckily, there were no more cyber events, but important to know that distinction as well. That after you have a claim, maybe you have $1 million cyber policy and you have a $900,000 total claim value incident. You only have $100,000 left for the year. So just important to know that when you're selecting your limits.
Hey, Trevor, that actually really hits home, because one of the things that I run into with my government contractors, and I think it would really be with anybody, is you have contract obligations. So when Trevor's talking about the fact that it's eroded the limit, we oftentimes will recommend that if you have a contract requirement of $1 million, well, we may want to look at expanding or increasing that limit, because if you have an event during that time frame and it's not related to that specific client or contract, you are now in breach of your contract, because you are not holding the limit that they are requiring for you to have. It's been eroded by another event.
Fantastic point, and totally agree. Yeah, absolutely. So those are some real life stories, and wanted to thank everyone for listening and for your attention. And I think we're going to move on to some questions.
All right, guys. Well, we are running just a little bit short on time, so I've got a couple here that I'm going to pitch out. First, maybe for Trevor, is we were just talking about this. What if I don't see the word ransomware in my policy? How am I going to know that I have this coverage?
Great question. Sometimes you do see the word ransomware in your policy, and it's great to have that specific wording, but sometimes you don't. I would say to look for the cyber extortion coverage section of the policy, because
everyone write that down, cyber extortion.
And that's really designed to respond to credible threats. So obviously a ransomware incident, if someone's in your system, is obviously a credible threat and would trigger the coverage. So if you don't see the word ransomware, it can be included in that, in cyber extortion. But, some kind of going off of the conversation about limit selection and really reading your whole policy, I have seen before where, clients will have $1 million of limit for their third and first party risks, but maybe down at the bottom, cyber extortion is limited to 100,000, what we call a sublimit. So really important to make sure that all of your limits are matched up. So that's where you would look for it.
All else fails, they could call you, right?
Of course. I love reading cyber insurance policies. Great bedtime reading.
Who doesn't? Who doesn't? That's another audit thing we look at too. We look to make sure people have good coverage. Felicia, going back to your example of the manufacturer. So the question is, because they got hit once, is that going to affect their premium going forward, or how much does loss experience impact their premiums?
So when you have a claim that comes into the carrier, so in this instance, they did not have insurance. This was a self-insured situation. They paid out of pocket. That hit their bottom line. But if you are insured for a ransomware attack and you have to utilize the insurance, it is there for that purpose. The underwriter will now contemplate that in the underwriting of your next renewal. And that stays on your loss for 5 years. So every year for the next 5 years, they're going to look at that and say, how much did we pay out? Now, it may have, the next year it's going to be a huge contemplation about how they're looking at that. Each year that's going to reduce a bit. And they're going to look at what other things have they put into place. They're certainly going to scrutinize the types of things that you've done to make sure that that doesn't happen again. So in this instance, if the way that they got in, they're going to look and see, have you done anything about that? Are you making strides to increasing or strengthening your cyber posture? And then also over time, they will look at whether or not you've had other events. But I would say if I'm an underwriter and I'm looking at that from a percentage, that is a pretty hefty percentage of what they're looking at. If they've had to pay, they're going to make you pay.
Gotcha. Well, that is good lead into my next question, which is you as well as Trevor mentioned some exclusions. Like if your employee clicks on something, maybe you're excluded then that's excluded from your coverage. So this question is for Jason. How do you mentioned on one of your slides, testing your employees, or, how do you test your network? Like, how do you make sure that you aren't one of these people that gets an exclusion because your employee went and clicked on something?
Well, I think, as I said, I think testing the end user, the employee, is probably one of the cheapest and most cost-effective but valuable things we can do, because usually the way these things get in is because we, as a user, click on something in the email. So there are several systems out there, several options out there, but what I would typically expect to see and suggest is that you are having some sort of ongoing program where you are phishing on a regular basis, and you are sending out links, and you're pretending to be the CEO wanting something or the CFO wanting something. And, so they get used to having things hit their inbox that sound legitimate, but are asking for an action that seems unreasonable. And they get used to looking at, certain types of higher risk things like click on this PDF or follow this link. Those are things that usually can help you launch something like a ransomware. And the more we train ourselves, the more we get caught. If we're open and honest about it and say, hey, we got this person, they got 4, and you kind of make it you gamify a little bit, make it kind of a fun experience, where you don't want to be the one that gets called out for having clicked on something or doing something. If you're doing that on a recurring basis, I'm going to say quarterly at least, maybe even monthly, you want to go through the process of sending these out. You get folks that are smarter and trained and stop and take more time before they click on something because they question it and they challenge it. And then as an organization, you start sending emails a little bit more intelligently too. Every time I send an email with a link in it, I think, wow, I really shouldn't do that. Because that's just part of the process. As you work in this space, you think, well, I probably shouldn't do that. Here I am telling people don't do that, and then I send it. So you would be shocked. I think people would be surprisingly shocked if you haven't done it, how easy it is to pretend to send an email and it look like it is coming from someone else. It's a very simple process in most cases. Getting a reply is a little bit more of a challenge, but it's pretty easy to pretend to be someone and send something. And so you've got to start training that user to go, well, maybe it sounds like it's from the CEO, but they never asked me to send Google Play cards to them, or maybe it sounds like it's from the CEO, but I don't know why they'd send me this here. We don't send links, or we don't send attachments. And that's one of the, there's a lot of things you can do from a security perspective absent the employees, but one thing I find a lot of times we miss is just making sure everybody gets tested. Because as you build a stronger environment, that's probably your first best line of defense, is someone that questions everything and says, wait a minute, I don't want to touch that. So that'd be my suggestions. Look into some of these phishing softwares out there, hire someone to do, I think Trevor mentioned social engineering, bring somebody in to do social engineering to test folks. And really, really, really most important thing I'll leave you with there is don't make it a putative kind of a relationship where if someone does get caught, they're fired. You want to train it where people are comfortable bubbling these things up and saying, hey, I clicked on something, I don't know what happened, but I'm scared. You don't want to automatically create an environment where people are afraid to tell you because they won't tell you, or at least that's been my experience. So you want to make it, gamify it, make it fun, train people, test them regularly, and let them know. When they make a mistake, maybe make them take some additional training or something like that. And so that'd be my suggestion.
Jason's idea of fun is clearly different than some of ours. So I can attest to that, though. That's what Jason and his team do at our firm. And I'll tell you, I think every email is sketch. I don't care who it's from. I'm like, I don't know, guys. I'm calling IT all the time. I'm sure they're tired of me, but I'm scared to click on anything these days. Of course, being a CPA firm, we're very vigilant and we are tested often internally. So I have a heightened awareness of don't click on that. So, well, thank you guys. I want to thank our presenters so much for coming today and sharing some information. I hope this was helpful for you. Again, we did record this webinar and it will be available to you on demand, as well as the presentation materials. You'll get an email later this week. And of course, be on the lookout for a webinar invitation in our Resilient Together series. We also have a website, weareresilienttogether.com, that has some more information and resources for you on these topics. So thank you again and have a great day.
Thank you.